So this is week one of a new lecture. This is August of 2024, and the lecture is Pathway Lecture 37, which is acceptance, right and wrong, right or wrong, dignity in humility. And that gives you a flavor of what the lecture will touch upon. And week one is about becoming aware of spiritual beliefs. And what I felt with this lecture was that it was not going to be effective to go at it directly. So I found as I worked with the ideas that the first thing we had to do was define the terms, because I felt that there was a lot of baggage connected to some of these words. We bring our own history and distortions about these words in, and you can't read them cleanly. So that led me to go to Pathway Lecture 233, opposite ends of the spectrum in terms of the sequence. And in Pathway Lecture 233, The Power of the Word, the guide speaks almost poetically about a way of understanding language, but not only just language, thought and beingness, that was revelatory for me. And so some lectures sing in my heart very frequently. And I found that this helped me start the discussion or the presentation of the materials by looking first at the words themselves, and underneath the word, the concept that the word actually comes to represent. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read a few sentences from the beginning of the study guide. They happen to be from Pathway Lecture 233. And I want to read them rather than attempt to paraphrase them, because number one, they're very poetic. And two, they contain something that I then want to bring forward before we get anywhere near acceptance. So in The Power of the Word, the guide says, the word carries immense energy powers of its own kind, differing from other energies. The word is what is behind all creation. Creation cannot exist without a word spoken, known, held, believed in, and committed to in the area of that specific creation. The word is a conglomerate of all these and more. The word that is spoken reveals the will that motivates this particular word. It can be the divine will or the will of the cut off, ignorant, and destructive particle of consciousness. The word is the sum total of your beliefs in any given area where you speak the word, be it conscious or not. Now, I, of course, interpret the lectures, so just take this as my interpretation. He's not talking about a word. He's not talking about the word acceptance. What he's referring to is how the word acceptance ever came into consciousness and got spoken in the first place, why it was used to represent something. That process is huge. That there was a consciousness and a creation, a desire to create, that began to formulate things, and that is the kind of word that is the original word. But it's not an English word, a Spanish word. It's not a verb or a noun. So that the word is an energy vortex that contains truth. By the time we speak a word, it is shorthand. Now, I'm very fond of snippets of various things that illustrate poetically and visually and in punchlines giant concepts and make them easier to understand. One of the snippets that I use to teach this particular concept is from Star Trek. And it's from New Generation Star Trek, where they are trying to deal with a culture that speaks in metaphors. And that's fine, but the metaphor has to do with their knowledge of their own history, of which the Earthlings have no clue. And there's another episode that I also used about how people use a word so differently that the word itself becomes meaningless. So these two snippets together help me try to communicate to people that it's not as easy as saying the word and being precise and everybody agreeing that that's the correct word. Because we could be agreeing that we all agree that our energy systems are matched by that word, but that doesn't mean that your energy system is the same as my energy system. So let me give you a few other examples. If there is a word, and it can be many words, song, singing, something around that, song, singing, probably 10,000 words around that particular concept. When I say that, I hear something, I remember something, I have an experience of what song and or singing is. It's a combination of rhythmic, of harmony. It's a combination of what it felt like to produce a sound in the choral group that I was in, or if you play an instrument, what it feels like to produce sound from an instrument. But let's say I was talking to somebody and I'm talking about song, but it's internal for me because it was a human voice sound. It was a sound my body created. But when they talk about it, they use the same word, but it's about how they got an instrument, how they made the instrument and how they understood the science of the instrument and how they played it and how they adjusted it. It's similar, but it's not the same. And yet we both use the same word. We may have the same attitude about the word. We may both enjoy the word song, singing, but we're not really talking about the same thing. But it's close enough, and it allows us to communicate. Now here's another example. If I say the words vegetable and or beef, and I'm trying to use this to include vegetarians, vegetable and or beef, pick the word that you want to focus on. Both of them can be prepared for eating in terrible ways. They can be mush, they can be rotten, they can be dry, tasteless, or they can be an indescribably delicious experience. And so when you say the word, it's going to be attached to your experience, your fears. When I say the word vegetable, I'm wondering, are you going to overcook it? Or is it going to be tasty? Is it just going to be grass clippings? Because I've experienced a range. Some people have only experienced the good range, and some people have only experienced the bad range. So we're going to have different reactions to the same word. And yet we seem to make it through the day using the very crude and rudimentary tool of human language. And it's good enough to get things done. However, when it comes down to spiritual work, I find that this isn't enough, that it is important to find out what we're loading the word with, what the word means to us. And that is what all the lectures really, from my perspective, what they encourage is it's not a matter of which word is the right word or how to describe the thing accurately. It's about understanding what happens to us when we say that word. Do we pull back? Do we reach forward? Is it a word that makes us feel wonderful? It is a word that makes us feel worried and anxious. Same word. So words are shorthand. Now I'm going to get around to Patrick Lecture 37. The idea is that this lecture spends a lot of time talking about acceptance and various other words for which we have a wide variety of experience with. And so when I started the study guide, besides using the quote from Patrick Lecture 233, I also went to a dictionary And I looked up the words that are used very often in this lecture, and I wanted to state the neutral version of the word, just to see if everybody agreed with that. Just to start a discussion of what does acceptance mean to you. So here are two examples. Acceptance, according to the American Heritage Dictionary, is the act of taking something offered. And yet for a lot of people, acceptance is defeat. I have to accept. Or it's a way to be included. I want to accept. And so what I'm expressing here is I think it's important to find the neutral middle ground of what acceptance is, so that when a spirit, a non-personality, is speaking of acceptance, we don't get carried away by how we use the word, how we've experienced it, how we've flavored the word. So acceptance, right or wrong, is the act of taking something offered. And the reason I'm going into all this detail is, why would acceptance, right or wrong, what sense does that make? And the reason for that in the lectures further on down the line is that the guide says that the concern of spirit is not what you do. You can have wonderful motivations and a tremendously loving desire, and yet do something unloving. It can happen. That spirit sees the intention. They see the motive, the intention, the desire to carry out, rather than the actual execution of the idea. From my history in grammar school, I remember when they brought in the idea that you could, they wanted to see your work in math questions, and I was not very good at arithmetic. I knew the concept, but I would make a mistake, a clerical error. So I got graded down. When they brought this in and they said, we'll give you credit if you were on the right track and you just carried the digit wrong or wrote down the wrong digit, hallelujah. I suddenly did really well in math because they were looking at my comprehension of the concepts, not my step-by-step execution where I was a little dyslexic. So same thing here, acceptance. If there's a distortion in your sense of what acceptance is, you can resist it or be overly aggressive about it, thinking that it will solve something. And so I like to bring people back to a neutral definition when they read the lecture. Acceptance as the act of taking something offered. The right or wrong comes in because we have right or wrong motivation, meaning we have self-centered motivation or unloving motivation versus a genuine desire to do what's best for everyone, a loving motivation. That's why acceptance can be right or wrong. Guide talks about pride, self-will, and fear, right and wrong. There can be good fear, good pride, good self-will, and distortions of that. I'm just going to give one more example. The word dignity is the state of being worthy of esteem or respect. The state of being worthy. I have inherent dignity because I am divine. I may not have a lot of worth to other people, but there's an inherent worth that I have just because of my beingness. And so when the guide uses the phrase dignity in humility, that can be paradoxical to us because sometimes we read, instead of humility, we read humiliation. And that's another word that I brought up for definition. And that's why I thought it would be good to start this lecture with looking at the power of the word and looking at definitions so that we don't go off with our definitions of or our experiences, our history of these words. And we take a look at the strict meaning that the guide is working from. Not that the guide's words are perfect, but they're cleaner than a lot of other words that I have read. So his choice of words seems to be unloaded with motivation or distortion from my perceptive. But when I read them, I put my own motivation and distortion in. I have found that over and over throughout the years. So it's interesting to get upset about reading something, go back, read it again from a different perspective and say, I wonder what I got so upset about, because I was projecting onto that paragraph at one point. And then when I wasn't projecting, I got a completely different read out of it. So the early lectures are more difficult than the later ones. The guide perhaps was getting used to speaking through a medium. He even said that at one point, that it was getting easier to communicate through the medium. It's beyond my understanding, but there may have been some of that in the early lectures because the language is more stiff and archaic. So that's what I thought I would bring up. Now, how does that come to do with becoming aware of spiritual beliefs? Spiritual beliefs are very abstract. So you can't see my beliefs. I have to communicate them to you. I can speak about them, or you can notice how I behave and make some assumptions and deductions from that. So this is where some people walk the talk and some people just talk the talk. So my belief system will manifest in the world in various ways. And I may be able to converse about it very consciously. Most of us are not as conscious as we think we are. By bringing in the idea that the word is this, it's almost like what I'm sensing is it's like a galaxy inside us that is forming, and the stars and planets are forming inside us. And there was a concept before the formation began, and that was the word. But from that to being able to tell you what I believe is a long journey. And I know in this lifetime, it's been a very long journey for me to learn to communicate feelings and beliefs. So we can't see that. We have to depend upon interpretation, deduction, assumption, watching, listening, comparing, seeing if there's any discrepancies between what someone says and what they believe. In the world of spirit, the guide says that they don't use spoken language, they use picture language. However, there are other areas in the lecture where he describes it differently, so I'm going to describe a conglomerate of ways he describes it. In spirit, when you see me, you see everything. There's nothing to hide. So I can tell you what I believe, but you see my reality. We don't have that on this planet. And so we have to work with the tools we've got. And the tools we've got include our consciousness, our intelligence, our ability to communicate. It also includes our feelings, not emotions per se, but feelings, our intuition. It involves instincts, but that's not spiritually based. Instincts are about survival. Intuition is a knowing. We can speak intuitively and not know where that came from, and not be able to connect it to something else that we understand and believe. It's a little scary, but it can be done. It can happen. What I'm trying to build here is an approach to this lecture, that there can be acceptance, and that involves certain things, and it can be done right, it can be done wrong. Depends on your motivation, your intent, your attitude, what you're doing it for, reasons you're doing it for. And then there needs to be dignity in your humility. I don't know the truth. I don't know everything. I'm guessing. I'm doing the very best I can. And there is dignity in that. I am doing the very best I can. Then in hindsight, I may see that I could have done better, but hindsight is a deadly thing. Hindsight is where you've already learned something and you're looking back and judging yourself for not having known that. It's quite unfair. So the dignity in humility is to say, I don't understand, I don't know, I'm working on it. When I understand more, I could change what I'm saying and what I believe and how I believe it. And this is where we, as humans, we fault people for changing. But if you didn't change, how would you possibly grow? So it's a huge lecture on that sense. I wanted to bring some depth or express what I see as some depth in it. I hope you read Pathwork Lecture 37, and thanks for listening. Take care.